Hello again. So welcome to Lam Rim on chapter 11 of book 3 now. Before we start, let's just set our motivation a little and consider how we might benefit everybody. And one way of doing this is to recognize what we can offer in terms of developing ourselves and understanding and freeing ourselves from our own problems. We can do that by following the Buddhist path, for instance, and through achieving the perfections of a bodhisattva, we can become enlightened, and then we can take all people or beings from a state of misery or into a state of happiness, joy. So we do this by through the six perfections, of which the six is the perfection of wisdom or insight, and this is what we're going through at the moment for the remaining weeks or remaining sessions. So this is a sort of part of what we're doing, and that's what we want to think about, is how this may help us if we consider and listen and come to our own conclusions about what's being said. And while I pause, or while I take a break while I'm reading or considering myself, then it's a good idea for us to mull over and think about what it is we're really listening to and how it may affect us in our lives. So last week what we really did was to establish one of the aspects of what it is that we are talking about in terms of the word emptiness. And primarily what it means is that it's lacking, there's something missing. And in terms of what it is, this it was also known as selflessness. What is this self, or this? What is it that this emptiness is? And Rinpoche says, following Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, the middle way scholars, he says that this is a type of existence. And the existence is one that is in the object itself. So intrinsic existence. And intrinsic means in itself. So naturally, by itself, naturally on its own, things exist. So the idea is that this cup exists naturally by itself on its own. It says this is what it doesn't have. Okay, so the cup exists, definitely, but it doesn't exist intrinsically within itself by its own. And Rinpoche is going to be talking further about that relationship between intrinsic existence and existence. So one, he says, is not there, this intrinsic, and the other one that is there, this existence, right? So I talked last week a little bit about Socrates, sort of a pile of rice. It's a Western philosophy idea, but the idea is to say if you take away if you have a pile of rice and you take away one grain of rice at a time, at some point the pile ceases to be there. And so, how can that be that a single grain of rice has this ability to change a pile into a non-pile if there's something within that pile which naturally makes it a pile, or a heap? I think the word is I was using heap of rice. So with that, then also it's, for instance, the idea of fist. Yeah, fist. And when we look at the fist, then it's like, where is the fist? There's the fist, and yet like it's gone. So where did the fist go? And oh, it's back. Is it the same fist? Is it another fist? So if it's naturally, if the existence or the existence of that fist is naturally here somewhere resting within it, then we have to explain where the fist comes and goes, just because it's here. There's something about this which makes it a fist, and just like the heap of rice and so on. So there's something about the quality of the cup, or me, or my fists, or whatever, that we're saying is, well, if we have an idea that it's intrinsically existent, then there's something within it itself that it gives it its being, its existence. And Rinpoche is saying it's that idea that we have. We very strongly hold on to this idea that these things exist on their own, just naturally, And he says it's this idea that we have that is a mistake. And then once we get rid of that idea, we're free. Why? Because essentially, when we begin to think that things naturally exist on their own, in this sort of suspended state, that they have this quality of existing naturally, then we can grasp at them. And we, thinking that we naturally exist on our own, are agents for grasping. We're able to grasp onto, we can hold on to things. And that creates all the ideas of ownership and self and being abused and feeling hurt when we're abused, and feeling, how dare she say that to me? Does she not know who I am? So this idea of this sort of inflated sense of identity is linked to a sense of actual natural existence, and I am here, I'm real, right? So this sort of idea is what we're trying to reduce or relinquish. But we're not saying that I don't exist or the glasses don't exist and so on. So this is what we're going to carry on talking about. So he asked a question. Rinpoche asked a question: how can we talk about all of the different things within cyclic existence, nirvana, samsara, and nirvana, freedom from suffering? How can we talk about all of these things as being possible in a system where we talk about the emptiness of natural existence, of innate or intrinsic or inherent existence? Yeah. Or essential existence. So these are all synonyms in this sense. We're not going into deep philosophy here, but the way in which we think that things naturally exist on their own. And he says, what the primary thing which we talked about last week, and we're going to go into restating ourselves here, what makes this able to exist is the fact that it was generated from causes and conditions. A potter and various different other fabricators and painters and everything else had brought it into existence. So the fingers and the hand and my actions created a fist. And it's this dependency upon the components and the time and the energy that's put into it that from which things arise. And therefore, it's because of this that we can talk about things existing. The problem is, in fact, if things exist on their own and naturally by themselves, then they aren't able to be created. They aren't able to be produced from causes and circumstances. And so this is one of the aspects of the middle way school, which is very clear, is that we can look at it this way and see that, in fact, it's because they are arising in dependence upon causes and conditions and agency and energy that we that we can determine that they don't have intrinsic existence. It says because dependent arising, because the ability to come into existence in dependence upon causes and circumstances. So when we're talking about this, Rinpoche uses these short terms, which are going to be used again and again. One of them is dependent arising. So arising in dependence of causes and circumstances, coming into existence because it's been created or it's been made from clay and wood and paint and so on, and these sorts of things, fired in the kiln, all of these different causes and circumstances, and somebody wanted to make it and so on. And it doesn't matter if it's a cup, and this is a manufactured thing, but what about a tree? Just the same, it needs the sunlight and the earth and the water and the moisture. So all the different causes and circumstances that allow for and help and assist a tree to grow. These are called, this shows that the tree or the cup or the fist are dependent arising. They arise dependently upon the causes and circumstances. So in general, when we use the word dependent arising, we're just saying that it comes into existence this way. This is how it comes in dependency upon all of these different things. And because within the middle way idea is that because dependent arising is completely available to us in terms of not depending upon an intrinsic existence, then he says because it's tenable, it's meaningful, we can talk about things arising in dependency without imbuing them or giving them or requiring them to have this intrinsic natural existence, then we can talk about suffering, because suffering can only arise in terms of conditions and causes and all of the other things too. And so therefore suffering can't just arise on its own spontaneously with no cause or no conditions or no sort of components at all. And therefore, if we can identify that suffering arises, then the causes of suffering, the origin of suffering, arises too. And therefore also the ability to cut those causes can arise. And also therefore the path to cutting the methods for cutting the causes of suffering can arise. And therefore we can say, therefore it's completely fine for us to recognize a lack of intrinsic existence without having to deny the Four Noble Truths. So the Dharma, the teaching of Buddha, is completely available to us, even though we say there is no intrinsic existence. So then he says, not only that, we can establish that if we have the Four Noble Truths, then also we have Buddhas, we have the enlightened beings, we have the teachers, we have the monasteries and nunneries and so on, and we have the community of practitioners. So in that sense, there's nothing within, there's nothing not available to the Middle Way school in terms of understanding the teachings, all of the teachings that are given, all of the methods and mechanisms of the Dharma, and therefore everything else as well that we talk about that exists in our normal world, that we can see or talk about, like cups and fists and so on. These things are available to us without needing to have this quality of having this intrinsic existence, because they arise in dependency upon these causes and circumstances. So one of the things that Rinpoche doesn't mention explicitly here, although he does elsewhere, is therefore, from the point of view of Buddhism, if it doesn't arise from causes and conditions, then it can't exist. And therefore there are some sorts of things that we as Buddhists, we say this can't exist because it doesn't arise from causes and conditions. And those things are things which arise causelessly, without a cause. For instance, certain types of God, for instance, say they are causeless. Or certain types of soul, if you like, soul or Atman, these objects can't exist because they a latent existence. They are not latent, inherently exist. They have this, they're not arising out of causes in the same sort of way. And it's because of this fact that we can, from the point of view of middle way, we can say that a mere existence or a non-intrinsic existence does not negate or prevent us from recognizing the Four Noble Truths and the practitioners and the common conventional world. And because of that, we say, for those of whom emptiness makes sense, when we recognize this distinction between existence and intrinsic existence, and we recognize that intrinsic existence is illusory, it's not present, it just appears to us to be there, but in fact mere existence is present and completely makes sense, then essentially we made this distinction, then emptiness makes sense to us, because what we're saying is that this illusory idea, this idea that somehow things exist within themselves, is clearly a mental add-on. We project it onto that, and when we do that, then emptiness makes a lot of sense to us. And Rinpoche says, if emptiness did not make sense, actually, sorry, he's citing Chandrakirti. He says, if emptiness did not make sense, then dependent arising would not exist. And so then nothing would make sense at all. So he's saying if we recognize emptiness, what we're talking about is emptiness of intrinsic existence, is the same meaning, is the same thing as dependent arising. So therefore, this thing about dependent arising and emptiness, these are sort of two sides of exactly the same coin. They're not just two correlating concepts. They are very much tied to each other. So what is a dependent arising is empty of intrinsic existence. What is intrinsic existent is empty of what is empty of intrinsic existence is a dependent arising like this. And Rinpoche says, just to be clear, when Nagarjuna talks about what makes sense and what does not make sense, he's saying these are the things which exist and do not exist. So then an objection made by some people about this is to say, well, if all things are completely without intrinsic nature, this nature on its own side, or it's nature by characteristic or existing on its own, if they are without this ability to exist on their own, then your words also can't exist on their own, and therefore they cannot refute the fact that things exist on their own. So he says, he responds to this, he says, no, because dependent arising is what we call emptiness of intrinsic existence, then those things which arise dependently have no intrinsic nature. So in a sense, this is sort of like trying to make very clearly this correlation. This is Nagarjuna, so it's not Rinpoche or Chandrakirti or even Aryadeva saying this. This is Nagarjuna saying this, and Rinpoche is pointing out, look, the core teacher of the Middle Way says this very clearly. He says, this. He cites then also again a commentary by Nagarjuna, a self-commentary, and he says, look, this idea that essentialists, because they can't recognize the distinction between intrinsic existence and existence, then essentialists look for something to criticize in us, and they say, your words, because they lack intrinsic existence, they cannot refute intrinsic things. And of course, the mistake here is to think that intrinsic existence is somehow existence, right? So here, in a sense, the response, of course, is because dependent arisings is emptiness. They lack intrinsic existence. This is what the same meaning is: emptiness and it's emptiness of intrinsic existence, so there's intrinsic existence. Sorry. And it says the things that arise dependently, those things that arise from dependency upon causes and conditions, right, are empty because, in other words, they don't have any intrinsic nature. They don't have existence on their side because they lack intrinsic existence. Why do they lack this? Because they rely upon causes and conditions. They're not able to exist on their own side. They exist in dependency upon other things. Therefore, they're not existing on their side. If they were existing on their side, they wouldn't need to have those causes and conditions to arise. And that's why we talk about them as being empty. So he says, my words are dependent arisings. They depend upon my voice and my thoughts and so on. And therefore, they don't have any intrinsic nature. And because they have no intrinsic nature, I can say they're empty. They're empty of this intrinsic nature, this intrinsic existence, right? And because things like pots and cloth are dependent arisings, they are empty of intrinsic nature. Yet a pot can hold honey or water or soup, and cloths can protect me from the cold and the wind and the sun. So with my words, because they are dependent arising, they lack intrinsic nature. yet they're fully able to establish things that things lack intrinsic nature. Therefore, this is a mistake. Your argument is mistaken. So this is, Rinpoche then says and points this out, is that there's the pervasion. In other words, this demonstrates that whatever relies on causes and conditions must. So this is like a sort of a logical step. If it depends upon causes or conditions, then it cannot. It's not tenable for us. It's not possible for us to agree that it actually has some sort of intrinsic nature on its own side. And not only that, that whatever does have intrinsic nature, if there were anything that exists on its side, then it cannot have causes and conditions. Now, although one can imagine that maybe that allows for us to talk about some things that do have intrinsic nature, in fact, within the Buddhist context, there is nothing that fits that. Everything arises from causes and conditions. And I think I said a week or two ago about this, similarly, that science, especially if we look at scientific method, we see clearly that, in fact, within a normal scientific community, the idea that things have an intrinsic nature is discarded. It's not agreed with. In fact, there's a tendency to recognize that everything arises from causes and conditions. So this is not different from modern scientific method. So he says, Rinpoche says again, look, remember dependent arising. Dependent arising is the basis for really understanding emptiness, and it's best to keep that in mind. And that only the middle way, the middle way is called Madhya Marga, which is just the Sanskrit word for middle way. The middle way school of reaching to emptiness. This is one of its distinguishing features. Is this idea that dependent arising and emptiness are the same thing. So he says, if we hold the idea that dependent production and dependent cessation, and cessation just means stopping, right? So ceasing to be, have to be essentially existence, and we use arguments against intrinsic existence to refute dependent arising of production and cessation, then those arguments will actually create a huge obstacle for us. We'll get really very, very confused very quickly. And he's going to go in to describe just how confusing that can be for us. He says, for instance, when we develop a sense of certainty that any object lacks even a particle of essential or intrinsic existence, we won't have any knowledge about the basis of that in terms of the causes or the effects within that in our understanding of it, because we'll say, oh, well, they don't either. So then we have to work out, well, what do we think about that? So then if we have a strong idea about cause and effect within our minds about how cause and effect actually work, how actions have consequences of any sort, right? So within that, then we'll find it very difficult to understand the absence of intrinsic existence. So these two appear, if we hold on to one clearly and understand how things are caused, then that's fine. And then if we hold on to the other, where we recognize the lack of existence on their own side, that's fine. But if we don't get those matching together, if we don't recognize their identity, then we'll find it very, very hard to reconcile between these two. And he says, while we do this, while we either recognize emptiness but don't understand the truth of causality, of cause and consequence, or if we recognize truth and consequence but we don't sort of actions and consequence, but we don't recognize the truth of emptiness, of intrinsic nature, then we've not yet found the middle way. So this view depends upon, we can test ourselves on this and very much jump and say, okay, this is how caused, and this is how empty, this is how the causes. And if we're not clear about how the emptiness of intrinsic existence determines and is subject to causes and conditions, then we'll find it much harder. So Lam Rim says if we really want to know how to do this, we would need to be really clear about keeping our ethical commitments. We need to do many, many different ways of collecting merit through doing practice, through meditating, through working in developing our compassion, our loving kindness, the other five perfections, and so on, and then in this way we can help to begin to clear away our obscuration. We can clear away our inability to see this clearly. It says, and then if we continue to make efforts to study and learn, then these things become more and more clear for us. So one of the aspects of this which is important is as things become more clear to us, the more we look at them, they become more clear. And this is a sign that there's a truth there. If we find that, in fact, things just get more complicated as we look, then this is a sign that maybe there's a deeper truth. There's something else there that we're not looking at, that we've made some presumptions along the way. And Rinpoche says it's actually this thing about this certainty about appearances, in other words, the way in which cause and condition work, and certainty about emptiness very rarely come together at the same time. Very, very rare. So normally we can see one or we can see the other, and then we're like, and then, and we end up either sliding in terms of our understanding from a position of nihilism where we see everything as being empty and therefore meaningless, or we see everything as being causal and we seem to not really understand how emptiness fits into that, and then we go back again. And so this idea, he says, this is very, very normal for us in terms of our progression. And he says, even, and Nagarjuna says, it's because those who don't see clearly would have difficulty understanding the depth of this teaching that the Buddha himself turned away from giving this teaching. So there was a tendency for people not to talk about this in a meaningful way because because it's too easy to get caught in one or another of the traps in the process. And Nagarjuna says again in his Ratnavali, the Precious Garland, he says, when we look at the impurity of our bodies, which is coarse and observed, very easy to see and continually appearing to us, or if you like, if you find that hard, the fact that we're going to die. So the fact that we're going to die is a fact, is definite. There's no doubt about it. And yet it's and it should be informing our every moment, but it's very hard for us to keep it appearing in our mind. We're always thinking about the future and what we're going to do next, or imagining we have plenty of time, or let's next year do this, or next decade do that, or whatever. This idea that in fact I might die just like that, we're not so familiar with, even though we know it, right? It says then when we come down to something like insight, emptiness, and he says where there's very little basis, no basis really at all. We need to actually understand how the nature of an absence works, how the nature of something that isn't present there. It's certainly not easy for us to see, and it's quite profound and rather subtle. I mean, the difference between existing on its side versus existent is really quite complex. He says, then how is that going to be easy for us to come to mind with it? So therefore, it says, because of this, because of its complexity, then generally Buddha used much more simple language in terms of its talks. So when we don't have this clear clarity, when we don't really see it very clearly, then the way in which cause and circumstance, or appearance, as Rinpoche is using at the moment, an emptiness of intrinsic existence, a lacking of intrinsic existence, before we can actually recognize both, then it's possible for us to make some mistakes. And one of them is that these, even in the texts which follow this tradition, they have these sort of arguments or means for being able to demonstrate the absence of intrinsic existence through a series of analyses. So a rational analysis is called a rational analysis, where we use sort of a logical progression of thoughts to demonstrate whether or not, for instance, a pot or a cup or fist is one with its parts or separate from its parts, right? So this is some of the analysis that's done. Or is it neither, or is it both? So these sorts of ideas are used again. And again, like looking at the cup and saying, you know, is the cup any particular part? Is it the handle? Is it the receptacle? Is it the size? Is it the what it contains? What is it that makes it a cup and not a pot, or not a jug, or something like that, right? So all of these things are saying, you know, we use this methodologies used within the middle way school to say, where is the pot that we're looking for? Is it here? Is it here? Is it underneath? Is it the whole thing altogether? But then, you know, which is multiple pieces. So this sort of idea, right? And then there's this idea of saying a sense of certainty that when we examine using this analysis, we examine looking for the pot. We can't find the pot anywhere. So we say, oh, you know, cup. So we can't find the cup there. And, or the fist, you know, oh, there is no fist here, right? And then they come to the same thing. So the analyzer, in other words, the person who's doing the analysis, the mental analysis. So saying, well, you know, is it this or is it that? Where is the analyzing going on? Where is the analyzer? And say, well, if there is, you know, there can't be an analyzer because it's made of components and parts and so on. And therefore, it's like, well, how is it possible for me to analyze anything if I'm not here? So then on this, we can come to some sort of idea, sort of feeling very confused or whatever, that things don't really exist and they don't not exist. It's all just a word game. It's all just, you know, things aren't really like that. It doesn't work that at all, right? So we can easily think that this is what the middle way school is about, and it's not. It's a mistake. And Rinpoche says this sort of lack of this certainty dependent upon using analysis in this sense of trying to determine the presence or absence of a pot by looking at its parts is missing the point. And what it does not do is to establish existence or non-existence. And this is where we begin to make a mistake. In fact, what it establishes is it removes intrinsic existence, not existence. The cup is a dependent arising. The fist is a dependent arising. It says, and therefore we should have this certainty that the very, very meaning, the actual final, fundamental meaning of emptiness, of intrinsic existence, is this dependent arising independent upon cause and circumstances. He says, and we'll find this, whichever text you use, whichever authors you use, if you're going to be within the middle way, if you're going to use the middle way text that explain emptiness, this is what you'll find. And he said, not only that, and not only is this the distinguishing feature of the middle way school, but it's also what Nagarjuna, what Aryadeva, what Buddha Palita, and Chandrakirti, all of the great masters of the middle way school, they all say the same. They all say this. It's not sort of interpreted or obscure. They say it explicitly, and they repeat this again in their own commentaries, both of their own work, but also of the work of their forebearers. So then it's this, because of this, when we begin to understand this, we should be thinking about saying, well, how is it rather than trying to establish existence or non-existence. What we should be doing is to work out what is the distinction between intrinsic existence, existing on its own side in its own way, versus a mere existence, just existing, and how is it that these two are separate, and why is it they're separate? And that's what we need to be working on, is that recognizing what it is about an object that makes it intrinsically existent, rather than it being merely existent in that sense. So this is one of the things, essentially, that Rinpoche is going to be is saying clearly. He's going to repeat himself slightly, but he's going to say that. So therefore, when we're within this understanding of this methodology for understanding emptiness, the point is to say is that nothing has even a particle or even a smallest hint or flavor or taste of existence on its own side, right? Although I look at that cup and I think that cup is there and it's sitting there on the table, the way in which it sits on the table, it seems to just do it naturally by itself, is not correct. That's not how it actually is fundamentally, or if you like, ultimately, that it doesn't exist in that way. And why? Because it exists as it exists as a continuum of causes and consequences that are continually changing. It's never static. It's changing from moment to moment, and just in terms of the molecules moving around, if you like, if you want to go on a scientific basis, it's made up of parts. It's not a single thing. So it's not it seems to be solitary, a single whole, one whole cup, but of course it's made up of all the different components, elements, and structures and atoms, if you like, and so on, that make up this cup here. It's not a single, it's a composite, it's a composite thing. And then also, not only is it changing all the time, not only is it composite, but also it is caused. So it's dependent upon causation for its causation, and it will be dependent upon forces beyond itself for its destruction in that sense. So it's just a continuum, this continuum like that. And therefore, being merely a continuum, which itself is made up of components and continually changing, it does not have any nature on its side. It just appears to be that way. And so Rinpoche says, not if there were intrinsic existence, if things did exist as they appear to be on their own, then all the teachings on Dharma would be wrong. But not only that, we wouldn't be able to function. We wouldn't be able to exist either. So when we begin to recognize how things arise dependently, then it's easier for us to recognize how they're empty of intrinsic existence. When we begin to recognize how they're empty of intrinsic existence, we begin to recognize how they arise dependently. So these two things help each other. So they both work together to help us get a better view. And so I said months and months ago, when we begin to understand how actions and consequences work, both mental, intentional, but also any other forms of actions, and how causality works in terms of how the flow of change, then we begin to understand how emptiness itself works itself. So it says, if we don't get this, we sort of say, well, as they have no essential or intrinsic or a nature themselves, and because they don't have any existence, then what else is there? In other words, there's a tendency for us to conflate or to bundle existence with intrinsic existence. And when we do that, we make a mistake. We start saying, well, there's nothing there then, right? And because of that, they say that there's no need to recognize that the fundamental nature of objects is that they don't exist, and they don't exist fundamentally or ultimately right? When we're talking about objects or whatever. So he says, if we think that the Four Noble Truths, the elements or the composites that make up a human, or the humans themselves, if all of these things don't exist, then essentially we are not only saying they don't have any intrinsic existence, they don't exist on their side, but they don't exist at all. Then there's no distinction to be made about causality at all, right? So although Rinpoche does mention it here, there's this sort of thing, you look at the Heart Sutra or many of the other middle way perfection of emptiness, perfection of wisdom sutras, and they say there's no form, there's no feeling, so on, so on, so on, right? And these are talking about all the things that don't exist, and it's not this, not this, not this, not this, and so on. So it's like very easy for us to say, oh, therefore they don't exist. And the point is the way in which it's talking about is how we see them as normally. We normally imbue them with this quality of them existing on their side. And that's the thing that doesn't exist, not that they don't exist at all. And this is the point that Rinpoche is making. So then we might think, oh, I'm not sure about this, because I sort of, I reckon that Chandrakirti says that that the teachings, the Four Noble Truths, and the aggregates or the composites that make up a human being, or things and fists and so on, they all exist conventionally. And therefore we accept that they exist if conventionally. Therefore, there's no mistake. I understand they exist as a convention, and therefore that's fine, but they don't really exist. Yeah. Rinpoche says it's not reasonable. It might sound reasonable, it might feel reasonable. It's very easy for us to have this thought, but essentially we have to also recognize that Chandrakirti said that all phenomena, including the ones we've just mentioned, have no essential intrinsic nature or existence, even conventionally. Right? So not just do they not have this, not only are they empty ultimately, finally, but they're even empty conventionally. So he says, therefore, our recognition that any argument that we use to refute or to demonstrate the lack of intrinsic existence must also refute it, even when we're talking about conventions, not just in terms of its final nature. And if we don't do that, then we're fall into the idea of thinking that actually everything is empty, or everything therefore doesn't exist. So because of that, it's like saying, if we think, oh, no, because it's conventional, it's not real, then it's like saying, but then essentially what we're saying is it's not real, and therefore we fall into one of the many pits or problems of re-establishing some form of, if you like, moral compass. So we need to be really clear about recognizing how things do continue to exist and have existed and will continue to exist, but without losing this particular quality that allows for us to grasp at them. So this is what we're trying to eliminate, is this grasping nature that holds on to existence, holds on to continuing existence, and puts value onto objects that they're not valid for doing that with. Otherwise, we're still tied anyway to the cyclic existence. We're still playing the game which is based in ignorance. We're still making the mistake of grabbing at things that we do not need. So at this point here, it's like saying, We've got to use this to work for us. It's no good for us playing philosophical, intellectual games if it doesn't make sense. We've got to grasp this sort of the nettle here and recognize that it's not about having a pretty view or one that meets our teachers' specifics, but one that actually works. And it needs to do these two things. It has to recognize a lack of value, a lack of essential value or nature that allows for us to imbue it with qualities, but at the same time not destroy causality. And the way in which Nagarjuna does this is by saying the causality that we need demonstrates the lack of intrinsic existence that that prevents us from being able to grasp at it. And when we see this clearly, then we will no longer grasp. So he says, if our argument refuting intrinsic existence, intrinsic existence means existing on its own side, as using these terms again and again, it can be like a bit confusing. I'm talking about the idea that this exists in its own way, on its own side, right? In itself, naturally in itself, it exists there. If we have this idea, and we think that the argument that refutes that it's this way also refutes attachment or bondage, or bondage here means not sort of sexual things, it means being bonded or bound to samsara. Okay, so production and disintegration. Then we're going to. It's quite impossible for us to recognize what Nagarjuna is going on about. And in fact, he says in the end, we're going to fall into either an essentialist point of view, which says things do really exist, or we're going to end up in a nihilistic point of view, which is things don't really exist. And if we have either of those, then we're not on the middle way. And an essentialist point of view, this idea that things do exist on that side is, well, if all of these things were empty, then there would be no arising and no disintegration, there would be no changes, and it would follow for you that the Four Noble Truths wouldn't exist. And it's because we're thinking that non-intrinsic existence means non-existence. So we might think, yeah, okay, fair enough. I'm sort of getting this. So, production, disintegration, rising, falling, all of these things, cups, fists, and so on, they're all possible. They're not possible within the emptiness of intrinsic existence. They don't have any intrinsic existence. They don't work there. They're not possible to happen even without that, and nor within the lack of emptiness of intrinsic existence. So they're just not possible at all. And since we assert that neither existence of intrinsic existence nor a lack of this, then we have no fault, right? I'm fine with this. It's like, yeah, I'm at peace. So he says the problem is essentially if we do this, we're sort of come to some idea that nothing really is or nothing really isn't, right? Then we're really saying, neither are the Buddhas, neither is the Four Noble Truths. And we end ourselves, we're pushing ourselves into a point where we're sort of saying that everything is literally illusory. It's just an illusion. And there's no distinction to be made between what happens in this world and what happens in my dream. If I kill somebody in my dream, when I wake up, there's nothing left, possibly a bad memory. If I kill somebody in this world, something is definitely going to be hurt. Something, there are going to be consequences. So the idea that life is but a dream is just not appropriate in this sense. It's not just a dream. It's dream-like. The way in which we see the world is not as it is, but that there are consequences to our actions in the world. And this is really, really important for us to get right. We've got to recognize that what we do in the world makes a difference. It actually has a very, very strong, powerful impact. even what we think, what we say, let alone what we do, all of these things change the world, change the universe. So this sort of way of thinking about it is like, therefore, we've got to allow ourselves to sustain and retain our responsibility, our sense of responsibility towards ourselves and to others and to all beings. If our understanding of emptiness lets go of that, then we're making a mistake, right? Completely. And we've got to really be very, very careful and be vigilant about making sure that we don't end up with this sort of view. And if we do, we need to sort of try and to work hard to recover ourselves, to find a way back in a way that allows for us to recognize the distinction between a causality, or the lack of distinction between causality, a cause and action and consequence, and the emptiness of intrinsic existence. What it is that isn't there, that we are bound to. So a lot of this is really to do with how we grasp onto things, and recognizing thirst, tanha, which is one of the 12 independent links, and this thirst for existence, this thirst for clinging on to things, clinging on to ourselves, clinging on to our beliefs. This thing here, we need to see how that works. And when we really understand it, the Rinpoche doesn't go on to it too much here. This is something we need to do for ourselves. When we recognize how that mechanism works in our minds, and then we can begin to see how emptiness works to destroy it, to negate it, or to prevent it from arising, then we begin to really have a much, much better idea about what emptiness means. And this helps us in terms of ensuring we don't go too far off our views. So the point about this is essentially we don't, the Rinpoche is saying we accept the Four Noble Truths, not as sort of skillful means. We accept that they are legitimate, completely legitimate. The path is legitimate. Therefore, we have to accept some form of causality. There's no doubt about this. We don't refute or dispute any of that. What we're saying is very, very specific. He says, like, think about a reflection. So in a mirror, right? So we have really good mirrors nowadays. So you look in the mirror, and it's very easy if we're. I remember when. Where were we? I think we'd gone to Switzerland for a talk by His Holiness Dalai Lama, and Geshe Damshala was a few doors down in another hotel room. And we're in another hotel room there, and each hotel room, like most hotels, were more or less identical to each other. And just by the exit to one's room was a full ceiling to floor mirror, which was cupboard space, and they'd put a ceiling to wall mirror on it. And even though I'm sort of quite familiar with mirrors, this mirror was so sort of complete, right from the floor to the ceiling. And because it was quite dim, sort of lighting is often quite dim in these hotels. When I was going towards leaving the door, suddenly there was this man appearing on this place, which was actually the mirror. Of course, that man was me, and the reflection. I was like, "Whoa, what's that?" Then I recognized it. Okay, so when they're talking about the mirror, they're talking about the idea that what appears to be there is not really there. So this emptiness, using like a reflection, is saying it appears to be there, but it's not really there. So anyway, I was like, oh, that's funny, because it reminded me of Je Rinpoche's text about this idea, or Nagarjuna's text of saying like a reflection, empty things like a reflection, right? So it appears to be there, but it's not really. And so anyway, I was going up to see Geshe for supper, I think. And I went in and I said, this mirror... I sort of thought it was me there, and he laughed. He said, "So did I, so did I." So it was like one of those moments. These mirrors were really very, very large, and sort of quite surprising. So So here again, Chandrakirti is saying, like mirrors, like the reflection in a mirror, it appears to be there. If you don't, especially if you don't see the mirror, right? And they still depend. It is empty things. In other words, it's just a reflection. It looks like a Ben. For me, it looks like I'm going to see Ben, right? So when I see this, it's just, oh, it's Ben. But it looks like somebody there. But in fact, the person is not there. So in this sense, is what's meant by the emptiness of a reflection is that it's not really Ben. It's just a reflection of Ben. Right, an image of Ben. So it's just a metaphor. It's not saying that that the emptiness of a mirror, the emptiness of reflection, is the emptiness of Ben in terms of intrinsic nature. But it's very similar in terms of the fact that it appears to be something there when in fact it's merely a reflection. But even reflections are dependent upon causes and conditions. Without the Ben, without the mirror, without the light, without all these other things, the reflection won't occur. This isn't, nobody's unfamiliar with this, he says. This is even like 1,000 years ago when mirrors weren't so good. He says, we're all familiar with this idea. You can see like animals jumping because they don't, or growling at themselves, not really recognizing a mirror sometimes. You see it on YouTube, right? So this sort of thing is similar. So it says, even though everything is empty of intrinsic existence, from those intrinsically empty things, effects are definitely produced. So just because they're empty doesn't mean that things can't arise from them, right? In fact, in a sense, the point of saying, if it's empty of intrinsic existence, then it exists, right? The idea, if it actually does have, if it arises from causes and circumstances, then we can talk about it as being an existent. That doesn't mean, for instance, I can imagine a pink unicorn floating through the clouds. Yeah, doesn't mean that, and that is dependent upon my mind and my imagination, my creativity, seeing loads and loads of children's stickers or the YouTubes or whatever. Creates this picture. So it's a dependent arising, but it exists, but it doesn't exist as a concrete unicorn floating on cloud. It exists as an imaginary object, right? So it's not as if we can establish just because I can imagine it that therefore it somehow exists in the world. So he says, if we get it wrong and we come to the conclusion that our reasoning refutes or demonstrates the absence of being bound to samsara, being freed from samsara, practice, understanding, and so on, then and we say, well, they can't be disputed. They don't exist ultimately. Therefore, but therefore they exist conventionally. Then in the end, we're really refuting everything. And we've got to recognize that this isn't an appropriate approach at all. So then there's some people think, well, look, if things don't really exist on that side, then the causes and effects of samsara just can't be. We can't talk about cause and effect or things. The way in which things arise and naturally arise, and in terms of cause and effect and so on, in terms of the interplay of elements and molecules and energies and powers. If they don't exist on their side, they don't naturally exist on their way, then none of this can work. And Nagarjuna, in a very well-known part of his original primary text, says, "Hang on, I was about to use that argument for you." It's like, in fact, we were just about to say, you know, if they did have intrinsic existence, then it would be impossible for them to function as they do. And he says in his poem, he says, you know, in his text, he says, you take your own fallacy and turn them into ours, like somebody who, while riding a horse, forgets that they're on a horse. He says, if you regard things as existing intrinsically on their side, naturally on their side, then you regard all things as having no causes or conditions, right? So therefore, if these things were not empty, there couldn't be arising, there couldn't be disintegration, things wouldn't be able to disintegrate. It would follow then that for you, the Four Noble Truths wouldn't exist. And there are similar passages. So a lot of the time, the accusations that are made against the middle way view is very much actually missing the point. And conflating again intrinsic existence, the existence by itself on its own, with existence. And when this mistake's made, then the argument comes back, because it's like saying you don't know what we're talking about, really. So he says, again, if we come to the view, and this is not at all unusual for us who are trying to understand Madhyamaka, the middle way school, right? If we say, well, then, you know, if there is no intrinsic existence and no essential existence, if things don't exist on their own side naturally as we see them, then what else is there? And he says, in this point, what we've done is we've completely failed to distinguish, for instance, a seedling's lack of intrinsic existence and a seedling's lack of existence. This is what he's saying right here, right? So because of that, they've also failed to distinguish between the existence of a seedling and the existence of a seedling by way of its own nature or its own essence. So it's like saying what makes a seedling exist is the idea that it somehow has something within it that makes it a seedling, right? This is the thing that we're talking about in terms of its intrinsic existence, that somehow within it has something or is something on its own side which makes it what it is on its side. Whether was saying, well, you don't need to have that bit. You don't need it at all for it to be a seedling. It can just be a seedling without having this sort of essence, right? So that's the point. So the word essentialist is people who think that things have an essence. When we think that things have an essence, we think that whenever something exists, it has some essence that gives it its existence. So when we see it without the essence, then they just won't exist. They just wouldn't exist. And I think we talked before about like horns of a rabbit, right? Or horns of a donkey. Donkeys don't normally have horns, right? Nor do rabbits. So the point of saying that non-existent here is something that just doesn't exist. So it says, therefore, when we have this idea, then we are stuck with this whole boundaries about either things existing or not existing, completely existing or completely not existing. And it's very difficult then for us to be clear about what there is in the world and to establish the truth, to establish Dharma. And more to the point is, if we hold this, it's going to be very, very hard for us to eliminate our thirst, our grasping nature, our grasping mind. So Rinpoche says, look, you know, Chandrakirti very, very clearly, very, very gently points out the distinction between intrinsic existence from existence. He points out the absence of intrinsic existence, distinguishes between the absence of intrinsic existence and non-existence. These two things, these ideas are like saying, if something doesn't have intrinsic existent, it doesn't make it non-existence. If something does have intrinsic existence, that doesn't make it exist. In fact, if something exists, it doesn't make it intrinsically existent. It doesn't mean it exists on its side. In fact, within middle way understanding is we can't even say if it has intrinsic existence, then it definitely does not exist. Is the major claim, right? It says if we don't get this clearly, then we're going to make a mistake. We won't understand the meaning of the middle way, which doesn't have these extremes. So I think some of this is going to repeat again from one of my comments, I guess. So when we begin to recognize that that something like the cup or my fist or anything or me actually has not even any essential existence or any inherent existence or any intrinsic existence existing on our side, on this side, or exist naturally through having some sort of essential quality or whatever, if we hold on to this idea, if we think that therefore it has no existence, there will be no ability for us to recognize cause and effect. We'll either have emptiness or we have cause and effect. If we have this idea that it doesn't have any existence, then there's no cause and effect. It's just illusory. It just becomes an illusion. And therefore we'll lose our moral compass because we won't be able to relate to the idea that what we do makes a difference. Yeah? Or we might think that whatever I do, it depends upon my mind, right? As to its efficaciousness, or as to what it does. It's just the way in which I perceive it. All that matters is I have to have the right perception, and then what I do is fine. Well, it's not true. We can cause suffering on others. We can make lives miserable very easily. We can make our own lives very miserable, and this is not beneficial at all. So there's this sort of aspect of saying is not recognizing that what we do makes a difference to others is terribly poisonous. It's toxic. So it's really important for us not to lose that in our understanding. If we don't understand that, then we're better off sort of siding on the idea of things do exist. But obviously, if we think that things do exist, and then we also think I exist, if we think I exist and I fundamentally exist and really, actually, truly, ultimately exist on my side naturally, then there's a problem, which is that I will see myself as a legitimate grasper at things. I see myself as legitimately wanting to continue and legitimately wanting to fight off those who would abuse me, or give me a hard time. So this sort of aspect is we have to be very careful with that. So it says when we accept that things exist, and this is what I was just saying, then if we fall into this idea that that there's no distinction between existing on its own side and merely existing, then we have to give up. We have to accept that that exists. In which case we can't see it as similar to like an illusion. We don't recognize that what we see is not as it is. So then we fall into this extreme. So we have to begin to recognize that in every single way, everything lacks any essential existence or any intrinsic. It doesn't exist naturally on its side. But at the same time, we must keep this definite knowledge that things like seedlings, for instance, or like anything else, everything also have the power to perform their own functions. They're able to do what they need to do. They're able to give me a cup of tea or hold tea in them, or grow into trees. And an oak seedling will grow into an oak tree, and so on and so on. They're able to act out the consequences, or inevitable consequences of what they are. So this is the idea of functionality. The ability to function is something that not only is it recognized as saying, in order to be able to function, in order for it to work, it's got to have this quality of not having intrinsic existence, rather than it being the other way around. So the way in which we think of things is that they need to exist on their side for them to be able to function. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The idea is that, in fact, they've got to not have any existence on their side for them to be able to function. And why? Because, again, when we look at the flow of action and consequence, they need to be part of that. So he said, when we are not clear about this, then we feel that the denial of intrinsic nature and prevents karma from giving rise to effects. So we're a little bit scared of that. And it's just the same who say that, who thinking that we're Madhyamakas, when we have this view that any arguments which refute or destroy intrinsic existence also refuse cause and effect. He says, well, we have this idea, then we've just missed the point. And he says, but everybody agrees. It doesn't matter whichever of these we agree. In both the Madhyamaka and the middle way schools, the essentialists and all other Buddhists agree that one thing is that as soon as we deny cause and effect, we lose our moral compass. We cease to be practitioners, and we have lost our way in Dharma. So this, he says, is really important for us to recognize. And he says it's not that, even though those schools that like the essentialist ideas, who hold on to things in a different way to the middle way school, they might accuse the middle way school of being like that. The middle way school says, no, we actually do assert karma. We do assert cause and effect. So this is not quite correct. So this sort of idea primarily is a very, very clear distinction, and it's important for us to recognize more than anything else is that how cause and effect arise, how do circumstances affect things, how are things caused, and what it is that means in terms of how they can come into existence is very important. So going back to Socrates, or looking at Heraclitus. Heraclitus was the person who said you can't step into the same river twice. Why? Because the river's continually changing and the person's continually changing. So not only is a different person who's stepping in, but it's a different river as well. So this idea of change, of flow of change, and likewise the idea of composition, things being made up of different parts, and the idea that things are arising and falling because of many different causes and circumstances, all of these point quite clearly to a lack of something that we naturally imbue. We see it as being there, but it's not there. But it doesn't mean that they don't cease to be able to do things, that they don't cease to exist, that they don't cease to have happened. There's no doubt that the mountains folded, and there's no doubt that the dinosaurs roamed the lands, and the sun and the stars all formed, and all of these things are completely accepted by middle way practitioners, even though there was nobody there to watch them. You know, the sort of tree in the forest business. It doesn't matter. It doesn't need to have somebody there to watch them. These things took place. The way in which they took place was not as if they needed to exist in some sort of way that we like to see them. They just did what they did, quite naturally, on their own, without any effort, just following the paths that is followed. But we like to sort of dress things up. We tell a story, and in the telling of the story, we begin to get confused about the way in which we see things. Not just humans, also animals have this idea. Animal can look in a mirror and see somebody there and go, whoa, who are you, right? So it's not just that. It's this idea that the mind has this tendency to grasp onto some things as being there in a way in which they're not. Okay, so that's, I think, quite enough for this week. So I think this is going to be the end of this semester, and I've got at least another session to do on this chapter. But I'm going to be we'll move on to semester 5, I think. So there'll be a short break. Okay, but before I go, let's think about using what we've learned or not learned, or got confused by or whatever, to establish that we see value in recognizing, well, what is this about, to see that maybe there's a way through this to be clear about the meaning of our nature of grasping onto samsara, what it is that Buddha is talking about in the 12 independent links, how that works, what the mechanism is for us to understand. And so hopefully to be a little bit more inspired to think more carefully about the mechanisms of our mind, not just sort of studying, but also actually recognizing experientially within ourselves how we grasp at things, hold on to things, cling on to things, cling on to the idea of self and self-existence. Okay, so and hopefully with this we begin to let go of some of those convictions that are keeping us bound to ignorance. And then let's finish with a sit, yeah? So